Hello, this is Dr. Paul Cottrell, and I'm going to be doing another episode of Graveyard Shift. And there's going to be two topics here. One is about this concept of the post-COVID era, or how I titled it in this episode, post-war COVID. And then, just a quick discussion about art and how to kind of use art or culture, literature, poetry, painting, film, whatever, to kind of capture an era, right? So before I start, I just want to thank for the ones that were listening to my thyroid T3 lecture and the innate T cell differentiation. I think there were some people that were listening to it and they didn't fully understand what I was saying. They are two disparate concepts. The whole idea of the T4 thyroid was to, just explain that there are mechanisms where you can still be in homeostasis, but there could be a mutation. And then in that previous lecture that I did on the naive T cell differentiation, that's a totally different topic. So, some people were trying to think that AIDS-like syndrome was tied to T4 in thyroid, and it's not. It's tied to the differentiation of the naive T cells and B cells and differences in regulation of Treg and all that. So I think people were misunderstanding what I was saying. So with that said, I'm going to be talking about this post-war COVID and art for the heart. Okay, so let's start with the post-war COVID. So, obviously, I've used the term post-COVID era to try to delineate what's been going on. Just like we had, a pre-9/11 and then, post 9/11 era. There's a differentiation of eras, based on events, pre-Lehman, post-Lehman, right? With the housing crisis that took place. So a perfect, or like, post-Vietnam, pre-Vietnam era, or, pre-Cold War, the Cold War era, and then the post-Cold War era. So there are these delineation points in history. And it's an important point here because the dynamics in one era is not necessarily true in the pre-era of that or the post-era of that delineation. So in this post-war COVID era, or the this post-COVID era, we're going to see at the scientific level or at the medical level differences in pathology than we saw in pre-COVID era, such as problems with long COVID, such as problems with injury from the trying to keep this up on YouTube, so injury from the V, right? So there's going to be some differences in what manifests at the clinic level. Cancer incidences are rising now. The prevalence of cancer will increase because our treatments for cancer are going to be a little bit better, especially with targeting certain types of tumor markers, tumor antigens and stuff. there's an expansion in biotech now because of all the money and all the investment that was going on in PCRing. There's a lot of capacity in the world now, especially in the United States, a lot of capacity for PCR. This is going to bring in and usher in a huge industry in terms of diagnostics for different, different pathogens or even different diseases, just by taking a look at that type of capability. Now, again, people that are in medicine, they know this, but people that are laymen's, they don't. You don't do diagnostics only on PCR, right? That's just one indicator on many. There's other clinical manifestations, there's, x-rays, there's other biochemical markers, there's, blood workup. There's a whole slew of things to understand that patient's situation, right? So it's not just one thing like just PCR, right? So, but the point here is that in a post-COVID era, the post-war of COVID, right, where we have a huge amount of biotech capacity now that we did not have pre-COVID, especially in PCR, and all of the reagents that are needed to be able to synthesize, right? So that capability will lead to further discovery. Because of the weapons program, there's been a gain of knowledge. And again, depends on who is using the knowledge, if it's going to be used for good or bad. But there's a gaining of knowledge at the tissue level, at the tissue level, what is being expressed or not expressed, what sort of proteins are expressed, what sort of proteins are not expressed. Different, even though, at the very basic level, most of your somatic cells are the same, but different tissues express different things. And there's a different methylation that takes place during the development, right? Of course, there's mutations and whatnot, but, and environmental stressors and stuff that changes things. But just to keep it simple, we have a genome. Let's assume it doesn't change. We have a genome, right, when we're born. And, just to keep it simple, but the tissues, they're different because there's different expression of that genome. Different receptors are upregulated or downregulated, different proteins and whatnot. And there's a very three-dimensional choreographic thing that's going on in the nucleus when certain cells need to transcribe, okay? Not all tissues, all cells transcribe the same. There's domains. There's some research that's been published there's different domains in the nucleus, and the chromosomes kind of move in these different domains, and it's very choreographed in a three-dimensional way. Even though we teach gene expression on almost like a 2D level, but it's really three-dimensional. So there's this huge capacity and huge understanding of these different tissues, what's being expressed. Well, when you know what is expressed in a certain tissue for a certain ethnicity, right? Because, for example, humans have ACE2 receptors, right? But let me get past this noise here. But hold on. So we build up these databases and we understand what these tissues are expressing, and we can also layer that at an ethnicity level, right? Now, everyone expresses, let's say, ACE2 receptor, right? If we didn't, we would be in trouble, right? But different ages, different races, different genders, they express concentrations at a different rate, a different, at a different concentration. Smokers will express ACE2 differently than a non-smoker. So there's these different layers of expression for proteins based on environmental factors, based on what tissue it's in, based on ethnicity and whatnot. So when you build this out of the roughly 30,000 genes that we have, then there's a lot of permutations. There's a lot of targeting that could happen. Now it's like a Venn diagram. There's overlap. There's no such thing as like pure delineation between one ethnicity to another, right? Or one gender to another, or one tissue to another. There's some overlap, right? So it's kind of fuzzy. So if you are doing targeting, you may be doing, let's say gene targeting, for nefarious reasons. You're going to have collateral damage because of that overlap. Now, you can take the same kind of concept and you can say, okay, we know what certain tissues are upregulating or certain ethnicities are upregulating certain things, right? And let's say they're in a certain disease pattern, and we know how to inhibit that process that's producing the disease, right? And so we can target, this is, gene therapy and precision medicine, target that specific problem. Let's say that ethnicity in this type of tissue is producing a certain protein, and we can create therapies to block that protein to stop the disease progression, right? For that individual or for that group of patients, right? But then you can flip it and you can go, you know what? We can turn this into a weapon. What are certain things that are more focused on a particular tissue or a particular group, even though there's overlap and there's going to be collateral damage, then we'll target that particular gene, and then they get a disease, or they get, they die or whatever, right? They get ill, you target based on that. So again, it goes based on what's the main purpose. Is it to help or to harm? Now, of course, there's going to be this collateral damage if you're creating a bioweapon based on this knowledge. Then you're going to try to reduce that collateral damage that's from your society. And that's when they try to design therapeutics in the biodefense or develop V's in a vial, right, that are eliciting antibodies to try to prevent that collateral damage for that population. And that's the whole premise of, biowarfare, especially with pathogens. You have some therapeutics that may be blocking, maybe they're protease inhibitors, or maybe they're blocking certain types of reverse transcription inhibitors, or maybe they're, if you're more on the bacterial side, maybe they're blocking, certain types of cell walls, but there, there's this idea that you'd have some therapeutics that are attacking the pathogen of weapon, this weaponized pathogen. And then you'd also have a system that is eliciting antibodies against certain proteins for that pathogen. Now, of course, there are going to be that collateral damage from those therapeutics and those V's within the vial that will be non-effective. But it can get nefarious, right? They can purposely put things in these therapeutics that may harm people, right? So, there's a lot of ways to cut this, but in a post-war COVID era, right? Things will emerge or have emerged that are very bad, and that people aren't paying attention and that they're somewhat oblivious to. Sorry for the wind. But there are other things that will emerge out of this era where it's good. And it just depends on what kind of society we are, what kind of governments that we have, and what the scientific community is doing. I think it's very important to overlay art with crises. Like, for example, you have the Oppenheimer movie coming out, right? That's out now. I think it's out now. And everyone knows, I would assume, that Oppenheimer was the one that was running the Manhattan Project, and the Manhattan Project was building the bomb, right? The atomic bomb. So there was this need to try to stop or try to end the war quicker, right? And there was this worry that Germany would get the technology to make this atomic weapon before the United States. And this is why Einstein tried to get Roosevelt to pay attention to this potential problem, right? Now, through Oppenheimer and the Manhattan Project, we end up getting the weapon, and we used it in Japan, right? Now, so, we ended up getting this kind of technology, and, obviously it ended up being the arms race in the Cold War, so there was some negative externality to that. There were some positives out of it, because we started understanding at an atomic level what's going on with matter and energy, and all these particle accelerators and stuff that spun off of that type of knowledge, and we ended up being able to understand at a subatomic level matter and energy, right? There were some positives that came out of the Manhattan Project. There was a lot of negatives, nuclear waste, arms race, right? But the point here is that the movie is a piece of art that is teaching history, right? And some of the lessons learned of what's positive of that history and what's negative of that history. And I think if someone looked at the tweets that I've been doing today, there is a ending of Platoon, Oliver Stone's movie, right? So it's Oliver Stone served in Vietnam. I think he did. I'm not sure if he did one tour or two tours, but so he obviously was affected by the Vietnam War. My father served in the Army. He drove a tank, right? But he was stationed in Germany during this time period. So he served. I think he got in right before. I think my father got into the service that last year of Kennedy's. I think he was in early 63, something like that. So he was stationed in the European theater. So my father didn't see Vietnam, but he served during that era, but in the European theater. And, people that were affected, the father, and, you know, that whole generation, right? You know, there was kind of, there are many layers of problems. You know, they didn't win the war. Their parents won the World War II, so there was, you know, there was a difference of generation. There was, you know, changes in in Congress and how the war was being conducted. You know, it was more for profit. Vietnam was more for a profit war versus World War II. And I know that people that are in history of World War II can, you know, debate at the nuances of what I'm saying, but that's not the big point here. You know, World War II wasn't as much of a profit. It was more of an existential threat between economic systems and political systems, right? It was so, but there was obviously there was a profit section to the war of World War II, but I think that the main thrust of the Vietnam era was because of you know, profiteering, war profiteering. So, but the film Platoon, I remember seeing it in the theater when it was released, and it was, you know, there's some cinematography history that's going on and being projected, and hold on, and you know, in certain scenes you can kind of see that Oliver Stone remembers certain World War II movies, and he was trying to reenact it. And then, you know, Charlie Sheen with his, you know, there was in this scene that I posted, it's interesting, he's carrying an AK-47, just like in Red Dawn, the original. So you know, so there's this, if you're into movies, you can kind of see that there's this little kind of wink that Oliver Stone's doing within Platoon that is hitting themes or a little bit of a scene or something to other movies, right? And at that time, it was one of the most realistic war movies until Saving Private Ryan by Spielberg. So in the end, there's this phrase, you know, the enemy within us. And I think it's telling, you know, we need to use art to try to capture what we just went through COVID and this post-COVID era, right? So there was a post-Vietnam era. Someone that captured that perfectly is Bruce Springsteen when he released his Born in the USA album, right? That was capturing the malaise of the 80s because of the failure in Vietnam, right? And it was kind of like the decline, you know, this idea of the declining empire and the declining of America. The zenith, let's say, you know, would have been World War II, and then there's this, you know, slow decline from North Korea and the South Korea War, you know, so the Korean War, and then Vietnam, and then there's this kind of like America's malaise. But then Reagan comes out and tries to reboot the entrepreneurial spirit of America and all this stuff, right? Now, I know this sounds kind of apple pie, but you know, that's in a nutshell, you know, what was going on in the projected history of America, right? Through Reaganism. And there's certain artists that captured that. Another artist that captures the time well, I think, is John Mellencamp in music, because of the failures that were going on in the farm industry back in the 80s, right? So if people are old enough, they remember Farm Aid, when there was this, you know, there was Live Aid, right? And then there was Farm Aid concerts, right? You know, to help the farmers. So that was a major problem. There was art capturing a time, right? So I think that we need to kind of like see what's the art that's capturing our time, our post-COVID era. And my concern is that this era that I'm talking about in the 80s, we didn't have social media, right? We didn't have, you know, the internet like we have today. Yes, the internet was there, and there were, you know, modems and BBS systems and, you know, bulletin board systems, and there was CompuWare, I think it was called, and Genie, I think was another one. But they were kind of like the early offshoots of logging in and posting stuff, right? And then AOL starts to become more popular, becomes very popular. And then people realize that the internet's free and didn't need AOL. But, you know, but the thing is that in our era, we have social media, right? And a lot of the stuff that people put out is junk. It's just junk. It's like pop culture junk, you know? It's not. So we're laying patina, we're laying sediment, cultural sediment, right? You know, through literature, through movies, through art, in fine art, and even in our social dialogue, right? And when we look back, like I'm looking back to the 80s when I was a kid, you know, and thinking back, okay, you know, Platoon comes out, is talking about the Vietnam era, right? And that era starts, you know, it really starts like I think it's like the late 50s, right? When we had advisors there embedded with the French, but it didn't really start to ramp up until like after JFK gets assassinated. So in 63, right? 64. So for some people at the time that Platoon happened, you know, it's around 25 years or a little bit more for their experience of Vietnam, but it could be as less as around 12 years, because I think the exit was around 74, 75, right? And I think the movie came out around 1986, all right? So, I don't know. People have kind of a different memory, right? The ones, there's a time span. There's a time span of like late 50s to all the way to 74 or 75, right? So my dad's memory of that whole era is obviously from, you know, 63 or 62 to 65 or something like that, right? But I think Oliver Stone's era was, I think, 68, around the 68. So there's these different little eras that's taking place in a different memory, right? And it's important to kind of be able to use art to kind of capture the moment, capture the understanding of what's going on. And so here's the problem in today's society. Everything is kind of chaotic, right? Now, people don't read as much as they used to, especially novels of, any large severity, like my parents' generation, right? People are writing less. You look at websites that were 10 years ago, the content on the website for a particular article was a lot larger than it is today. It's streamed down because, everything's turning visual. So there's an immediacy that's happening. So we're losing, I think we're kind of losing the potentiality of art to be able to capture the moment and to be able to understand what people have gone through. What my father went through during the Vietnam era is different than Oliver Stone's version of the Vietnam era, right? My version of COVID is going to be different than your version of experiencing COVID, right? But they're just as important, right? So we're losing, I think people are losing this idea. We're becoming kind of more pragmatic. You know, we need it. We need the information now. We need it. You know, so we have this. We're moving towards like a technocracy. You know, kind of like, well, what is it right now? And then we don't realize, well, wait a minute, the post-COVID era or the post-Vietnam era is just as valid as the Vietnam era because of all the aftershock of the Vietnam era and how it changed the psyche of America. I think Forrest Gump, you know, also captures this pretty well, right? But we're in this new age. And I don't think the scientific community, because you know, everyone wants to be pragmatic, right? I don't think the scientific community has the skill set to understand that it's okay to be a little fuzzy. It doesn't have to be all mathematically perfect. Because with allowing it to be a little bit fuzzy, culturally, it allows us to be able to kind of absorb it. What does this mean for us? What does this mean for us at a societal level? What does it mean for us at our family level, right? Yeah, I just feel that the sediment, the cultural sediment that is being laid down in social media is not necessarily truly representative of what we need to really understand what we just went through and what we will continue to be going through because of this aftershock. Case in point, publications are being censored that are trying to use science to explain what exactly happened with the V and with, you know, the different pathologies that happen with the virus also, right? So the virus and the V, obviously everyone knows what the V is. But, so there is a censorship that's taking place. So we're losing that cultural sediment of scientific knowledge, right? And it's additionally buried with a lot of social media junk that's out there. I mean, you know, so you know, it's going to be harder to kind of drill down as a sociologist and like really understand 100 years from now, assuming we survive, you know, really understand what really happened in this era, right? Now, we know, just like how a Vietnam vet would know what happened in that era, right? But do we, meaning the younger generation that didn't serve in Vietnam or, you know, served in the Vietnam era, do we really understand that? Do we understand World War II? No, of course not. My grandfather knew World War II. I mean, he served in it, you know, so he knew it more intimately and he knew what it meant through his experience, right? So we only can use the culture and the history that has been passed down to kind of understand what's going on here. We have just gone through a major event, the COVID event, right? And it's important to like really like go, what happened? You know, everyone was like worried about their job and worried about getting sick, and some people died, and you know, others, you know, are continually being, you know, affected by it at a financial level or at a physical, biological level, emotional level, right? People are still suffering from it. I was talking on the previous, you know, two episodes ago, you know, about the PTSD of COVID, right? You know, going through this whole situation for medical school and healthcare professionals and all this. It's real. but there's also a PTSD for actually patients. That's actually one of the indicators for long COVID. There's an emotional component that's tied to long COVID that people don't talk about. So I think it's important to use art, and I've tried throughout the 3 years of covering it to try to capture it in pictures or capture it in phrases, to kind of give it another dimension, give it a little bit of a fuzzy dimension that's not so scientific. Yeah, I could sit here for 10 hours talking to you about all the mechanisms that are tied to AIDS-like syndrome. I could sit here for 10 hours and talk to you about the genomic changes that took place for SARS and SARS-CoV-2 that were all man-made, right? But there's a specificity to that, but it loses the human component. That's my point. And humans are fuzzy. Humans, it's fuzzy logic, and there needs to be a cultural dimension to fully understand this completely. So I think that using art to try to capture the moment. So the big takeaway from this, is we're in a post-COVID era. COVID's over. Yes, there's going to be some blip-ups here and there, right? There may be another drop that's tied to fourth or fifth cocktail, but that would be a new era, right? That would be a different era. That's not a COVID era. That's a different era. Just like how wars, when they happen, they're of different eras. Even though there's probably a case that can be made that war has never ended since we came out of caves, and it's all been one big war, but that doesn't help us to be able to delineate eras and to be able to teach it and to be able to understand it. So for our simple minds to be able to fully understand and comprehend the full history of mankind, we break it up in eras, or we break it up in dates, right? So the post-COVID era, it's going to be embedded in us, just like when Vietnam ended for the ones that served in Vietnam or during the Vietnam era, right? And I don't think people are appreciating this, and where this can all go. There's these pathologies that are going to start to pop up: the cancers, the AIDS-like syndrome, the opportunistic infections, right? The genomic targeting that's going to take place in biowarfare. Kind of scary stuff, right? But there's a positive side to this, and this is just like you can target certain things for war, you can target them also to fight disease. It just depends on the type of person you are. And this is the reason why I get so kind of upset with people that have the knowledge to understand and have the knowledge to help heal people, right? But yet they end up working for nefarious actors because they can make money, and or get money for their laboratory or whatever. I remember, this was before I went into medicine, right? I remember when this was shortly after I finished my PhD in finance. I was developing a software. It was called Poseidon, right? And it was based on my dissertation work, right? Algorithmic trading and market analysis and mapping the market in 3 dimensions based on 3 variables, right? And predicting heteroscedastic volatility, right? And I wanted to make it where it was like a 3-dimensional kind of market trading platform that would compete with Bloomberg. And instead of looking at a price curve that's 2D, you're looking at the volatility and the probability of the next price move, right? Based on a probability surface function. All right. And if you do this, not just in one commodity or let's say one stock, but you do this for many different stocks or many different asset classes or different sectors of the economy, you actually see a volatility wave starting to propagate within the market. All right. So I was talking to a lot of VCs that were in California about this. And at this time, fintech, there was some money to be invested in fintech, but they were all focused on kind of like the Robin Hood type fintech, right? They weren't focused on desktop application trading system for professionals that's very high-end mathematics, right? And that needed a lot of horsepower. Wanted everything on an app that was running on a phone at that time, right? And so I wasn't able to procure any seed money for the software development. So I just kind of like, okay, not going to do it. No, it's just I was tired of. I don't even like coding. So for ones that code, they realize that every time there is an update with the operating system, you're constantly having to debug your platform. And when you have hundreds of thousands of lines of code, it can be a pain in the ass, right? Especially if you're a one-man show trying to develop a software that's involved, right? So there was the coding aspect to it, and then there was the PhD type level stuff that was the backbone of it. And I can't stand coding. I don't have the patience for it. So I just dropped that development for Poseidon. And I forgot now where I was going with this. Where was I going with this? And I lost my train of thought. But yeah, I forgot what the main theme was on that. Unfortunately, I forgot that thought. Sorry about that. But then, just as a historical lesson here, then I said, okay, forget this. I'm going to pursue medicine. It's a shame that I lost the thought, or what the theme, what the thought, what the point was. Maybe it'll come back to me, whatever. But, okay, so going back to art of the heart, right? For us to understand what we just went through, we need to use art. We need to use film. We need to use music, right? To capture those moments, of what I felt when I treated my first patient that had COVID, right? Or how I felt when I lost my mom to COVID when she was in the nursing home, or how I felt, during COVID. I did, a research project that was tied to the TAT protein that was preclinical trial on treating GBS and other autoimmune disorders, right? And the carnage that we had in the lab because of all the rats. We had specially bred rats, Lewis rats, for this experiment, and doing the autopsies on these rats and harvesting the tissue and being able to do the pathology and figure out what was going on and how what was the mechanisms, were they responding to the TAT treatment and all this stuff, right? There was a lot of blood in that lab. So there was kind of like, there was a sacrificing that was going on to trying to help people that had autoimmune disorders, right? That's a memory that was taking place during this whole COVID arc, right? And obviously, having a treatment for autoimmune disorder, is an important piece to being able to treat people that have been injured, right? Because there's an autoimmune component to this. There was an emotional thing. I mean, it was a very scientific, right? For me to collect the data and, cut up the rats and treat them with the tat and everything, right? Or see their, literally opening up their abdomen while they're anesthetized, opening up their abdomen and seeing their heart pump, right? So you open up the abdomen and then you breach the thoracic cage, right? You snip the sternum, and when you pull that out, you can actually see the heart just pumping, right? And then putting in a syringe to be able to get the blood out of the left ventricle so we could analyze the cytokines, the cytokine profile. It was gory, right? And I felt bad for the animals. I had these animals named, some of them, not all of them, because there were a lot of them. But certain ones, when you're around them for a while, they have personalities, right? And when we had to harvest the tissues, it wasn't a nice day, not at all. It was actually 2 days of carnage when we were harvesting the tissues. But that's a memory, and then hopefully that leads to other discovery to help for autoimmune disorder, right? That's something that I kind of have in my memory during this whole COVID era. I'm sure that people have something that's maybe not necessarily as as graphic, but I'm sure that there's moments in your life from late 2019 to early 2023, or wherever you want to delineate the ending of your memories. And this is why we need art, why we need culture. But it's also important to have kind of like a realization that not all pop culture is good, right? The quality of it is going down, especially when you're starting to see people that they're trying to monetize their Twitter channel now. You're going to see, I suspect that when everyone starts to try to monetize their Twitter channel, you're going to have some people that do good content, but a far majority of them is going to be crap just to get impressions. And those impressions will drive ad revenue for them. So there's going to be more layers of poor quality content that's out there instead of unique content, right? You're kind of almost starting to see it now with the people that were unknown pre-COVID. And I was relatively unknown in pre-COVID, right? I had a very small channel, 500 people or whatever. They were listening to my ramblings. So, and then when COVID happened, then it exploded, right? And then you had these other people that started to pop up on the scene, like the Stu Peters and, and the Kim whatevers, right? There was these people that started popping up. Some of them do their show more professional. Some people do it a little bit more ad hoc. I prefer ad hoc. I think that's a little bit more real. Some sort of high production with a lot of post-processing. But, people start popping up. So you're going to see people on Twitter that will have good content, right? Let's say high post-production value, but there's going to be a lot of people that is just regurgitating just rubbish. And unfortunately, it's the hygiene of the content within Twitter, I think, is going to go down because everyone is trying to get, a free check from Elon Musk, right? It's not about content. It's not about the integrity of the art or the science. It's all about just impressions. We're the impression generation. We've moved from the selfie generation to the impression generation. I'm sure someone will use that phrase somewhere. Like a lot of people have stolen a lot of stuff I've done. But, and we're moving into the impression generation. We got to get impressions so we can have ad revenue. Right? So the quality of it is going to go down. And so you see these people that are in this, that were covering COVID, right? And now COVID's dying out, right? Right? As like an everyday number kind of situation, XYZ number, certain number in ICU, or, number of people dying in New York or whatever. It's not going to be like it was back in the day when we were covering it. This is post-COVID era. And the ones that were real, that understand what was going on, are going to flourish in the post-COVID era. Because you're starting to see it with the Stu Peters and the Kim Ivor, whatever her name is. They're struggling to try to get people on their show. You're starting to see it. I'm starting to see. I get a lot of emails in the background, right? A lot. And some people will go, I'd like you to be on my show or whatever, especially when I have a piece that gets a lot of views, right? They always seem to pop up whenever there's a piece that I do or a tweet that gets a lot of things, right? Some tweets I only get a few thousand. Some I only get a few hundred. But there's others that I have 600,000. So whenever I go viral on something, on a video or whatever, they always pop up. Because they have created a system that it's about producing content for you to absorb so they can get ad revenue, right? And it has nothing about really the validity of the content, right? So you're starting to see it happening. It's just starting because, they built their channels based on a crisis. The crisis is over. Now it's the real people coming in and saying, well, wait a minute, AIDS-like syndrome because of the dysregulation of the immune system. Oh, opportunistic infections too. Oh, gene integration. Oh, V injury, right? The pathologies are starting to pop up. So you're gonna start seeing channels, certain higher production, post-production channels starting to struggle, and they're going to have to shift to something else, and they'll start ending up being kind of not as entertaining. Maybe that's the wrong word for it, but as viewed. So they're going to have to pivot to politics, and they'll pivot to certain types of memes, the president or whatever. Politics is usually a big pivot when they don't have any content. If you remember back in the 90s when even the 80s, it was 80s when CNN started with Ted Turner. He was the first cable news network, right? And they said that there was not, when he was pitching this, everyone was saying there's not a news that's going around in the world to be able to do it for 24 hours. And the reality was it was somewhat true, right? And they had to repeat the shows many times throughout the night, right? But then the society became more and more connected, globalization. Back then it was, satellites and all this, and then now everything is more internet connected, not satellite connected. And, now there's a lot of content that you could have probably truly a 24-hour news network, but the reality is RT or Sky News or Bloomberg or CNN, they all kind of regurgitate the same information just in slightly a different package, right? So it's not like 24-hour news, it's 24-hour regurgitation, only for that news cycle to end and start a new regurgitation. somewhat see that starting to evolve with some of these channels, I think. There's going to be this kind of like maybe seeing the same people being interviewed, pushing kind of the same thing. For example, if something big happens in the finance world, then you're going to hear a finance guy on one of these alternative channel news, right? Oh, we'll bring XYZ to talk about the stock market crash, right? And then when there's a war that's starting to pop up, then we'll, roll in some ex-Marine or whatever, right, to talk about the war. And they'll cycle it just like CNN cycles it, right? Instead of actually seeing a problem and actually diving in and trying to solve the problem. So, because there's this push, because now they have built up a channel and built up revenue and have been on this monetization ad revenue scheme, and they've built their life around it for the last 3 years. It's very hard for them to cut it off because they're probably not independently wealthy, or they didn't, they don't have other means of cash flow or whatever. So you're going to see this kind of stress, and they're kind of all kind of put, not all, but many of them are going to pivot to this kind of problem where it's going to be a regurgitation, same old, and back in the 80s and 90s, there was kind of like, and maybe even before COVID, the news there'd be kind of like a slow news day, that all of a sudden something big happens, like I don't know, a bombing somewhere, or a terrorist attack somewhere, or missile launch from somewhere or whatever. But then there's this slow news kind of thing. So we're kind of like getting back, or reverting back to slow news, right? And some of these channels are going to struggle through that, because it was predicated on high frequency information that was changing rapidly, what I called the fog of war, right on the battlefield. And covering that is very hard because it's constantly changing, right? Now, war correspondents, I think, are probably the closest to understanding what I'm talking about. But we're moving in this post-COVID era, right? And when you're talking about just covering news in the post-COVID era, we're going to have this, we're reverting back to normalcy somewhat. We're not the same, right? Because we've been perturbated, we've been changed socially, physically, financially, whatever, right? So we're changed permanently, right? But we're kind of moving back to normality. There's a normalization that's taking place. And a lot of these channels that were predicated on high frequency changes are going to struggle because we're moving into a low frequency change, okay? Like, for example, when I was covering COVID, every day was something new. What was going on in Wuhan, or what was going on in Taiwan, or what was going on in California, or what was going on in Michigan, or what was going on in New York, right? There was lots of things going on all at the same time. So it was like fog of war, right? We don't have that now. Now we're shifting to low frequency. So when I say, because everyone was focused on the acuteness of COVID, the acuteness of what was going on in our economy and everything, because you felt it almost immediately. You felt it affecting you almost right away. The lockdowns, or, layoffs, or the crash in the stock market, or whatever, the forced V, for your career or whatever, right? You felt it. It was very tangible. Now, in the low frequency information world, in the post-COVID era, it's going to be cancers. It's going to be these long hauler syndromes. the psychological trauma that took place during this period of time. Those are low frequency, and they're not necessarily immediate for the listener of the channel, for the viewers. And so they kind of tune out because there's cognitive dissonance. But it's very real. Like when I said, oh, cases are going to ramp up here and here and here, and this is why, and there's the antibody-dependent enhancement and blah, 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 right? It happened, right? I've been famous to be saying on some early on that I was concerned about in 18 months. This is the first, it may have been the beginning of the second quarter of 2020 when I said this. Could have been the end of the first quarter of 2020. But on many channels, and even on my channel, I stated, that I was concerned that my projection was that in 18 months from then, that it would be 65 million people that in the United States contracted SARS-CoV-2, and that my worry, because of the high comorbidities in the United States, such as heart disease and diabetes, that we may see 6.5 million people that passed away from SARS-CoV-2 within that following 18 months. Well, I was pretty damn accurate on the number of cases. It ended up that in that 18 months, around 59, I think it was around 59 million. And that's probably understating what was really going on, but let's just, use the official numbers. And at that time, we were just under, I think we were around 950,000 deaths, all right? What was not known when I said that was that diabetes medication, like metformin and other things, is actually protective for COVID, which is very few people know or understand that, and how that actually helps with some protection. It's not perfect, but some protection from MERS and COVID, MERS and SARS-CoV-2, right? That diabetes medication for many had a protective function. That was not known when I brought that up. So, people go, oh, you don't know how to project. I made a living in finance projecting. So, but there's these variables that take place that are unknown that could be negative or positive for us. And in this case, at the time, we didn't know that diabetes medication was actually mildly protective. So the comorbidity rate was actually truly lower than what was thought in the first quarter of 2020 for the United States. And this is the reason why a lot of people didn't pass than what we were projecting early on, because comorbidities, heart disease and diabetes is huge in the United States. That's an understatement. But it's a pleasant surprise to see that diabetes medication is somewhat protective of MERS and SARS. So, that was a pleasant surprise, right? And that was kind of like in this high frequency environment where, there was a lot of unknown and there was a lot of things that were just popping up, and right? But in a low frequency environment, it's slower. It's slower, and people will get cognitive dissonance and they won't pay attention, and they'll say, oh, it's not going to be happening to me. I'm fine right now. Why should I worry about myocarditis from the V or from the virus? And by the way, you can get both, right? From the virus and the V, right? Right? So people will go, well, I don't have to worry about that. I'm fine. Well, maybe you're not. You just don't know, right? And all these other things that possibly could happen: genomic integration, AIDS-like syndrome, opportunistic infections, autoimmune disorders, and cancers, right? So if you feel fine right now, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not happening. It's slower frequency. It takes a little longer for it to evolve. So everyone was so focused on the acute
Did they catch it? Did they get the sniffles? Did they get a fever, or whatever? Or do they, are they coughing up their lung? Are they getting into ARDS, right? Right? Or, are they crashing? Whatever, right? And if they're not, then they assume that there's no problem for them, not realizing that you can be asymptomatic or mild case and still have these pathologies that I've been talking about later down the road in a post-COVID era. It'll take longer for them to manifest, but they will manifest, no doubt about it. There's no doubt about that. But, people have cognitive dissonance. And so this takes me to, bless his heart, right? But I think what I'm going to be saying really hits home the importance of understanding high frequency and low frequency. Something that's acute versus something that's chronic and latent. All right? My last show with John, what's his name? McLaughlin. We did, I think it was in I think our last show was in 2020, near the end of the year. Might have been the third quarter, fourth quarter. It may have been the beginning of 2021, the first quarter, but my memory serves me that I believe it was the third quarter of 2020. We did 2 or 3 shows, right? But there was this one show where George Webb was with him. They were at a remote, they weren't at his house. They were at a remote facility or something. I don't remember where, like an office or something. I remember them like almost in a hallway or something. And they were sitting at a table, and John, had his, he had his show. So I called in, and I think it was through Zoom at the time. I think it was Zoom. Maybe it was something else. But George was next to him, sitting next to him. On his, it would have been John's left, right? But if you're looking at the screen, George would be on the right. So we were talking about the latest news, right? And I was talking about variants. This was the time when we were starting to talk about the beta, gamma, delta. And I was saying that there was monoclonal antibodies that were being treated in convalescent homes, and that there were mutations that were starting to take place through the monoclonal antibodies, where these people that had SARS-CoV-2, they recovered, and then they relapsed, and they had mutations in the relapse, right, that showed a mutation convergence that was very similar to what they were seeing in the UK. This was data that was coming from the United States. So I was mentioning this published paper and blah, 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 that we have to pay attention to these new variants that were popping up. So this is, that this was during that alpha, beta, gamma situation. They were probably talking about beta at the time. Maybe it was, delta. I don't know. I don't remember. But it was one of the main variants before Omicron. And I said, this is going to be a problem. This is going to be a problem, John. Listen to me. It's going to be a problem. And by the way, it's showing that, there's a tracking of mutation based on monoclonal antibody treatment in people that had suppressed immune systems. You didn't pay attention. He's going, I don't believe it. I don't think it's going to be that big of a deal, because the reference was the acute phase from the first wave. Now we're talking about like the second or third wave in the United States, right? Depending on how you count it. I always count the waves relative to New York. And so, there's a New York wave, and then it propagates across the country. And I'd still consider that wave at the state level in conjunction with the New York one. But if you zoom out to at the countrywide level, it looks like there's multiple waves happening over the 3 years. So it depends on how you define a wave. You can define a wave at the state level, or you can define the wave at the national level. All right. But if you define it from what we were seeing at the national level, it was looking like, I think at that time it must have been probably the second wave. Might have been the third, depending on when we had the conversation. But the bottom line was, it was post D641G mutation, and it was the emergence of, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, whichever one it was. Maybe it was delta, maybe it was gamma, I don't remember. But the point is that there was this shift in mutation where it could be pathologically, it could be problematic. John didn't want to pay attention to it because he fell into the trap that acute must mean severity. That if it's an acute infection, right, and that if there's a high death, then that's bad. Yeah, obviously that's bad. But you can have an acute situation that's not high death rate, but in the latency part of this, right, or in the chronic part of this, those individuals will have pathologies that are different, that are just as problematic. And he didn't want to listen to this. This is the last time I was on his show. And I was a little perturbed because I knew right away that he was one of these cognitive dissident bullshit guys, right? Well, what happened? I don't know his vaccine status. I don't really care what his vaccine status is, right? But I suspect, because supposedly he has prostate cancer now, right? So the point I'm making here, and it was in remission, right? The point I'm making is that there were people that didn't pay attention to what I was saying, and they thought that it was not that important of a mutation for the virus, and that it was no big deal to get it, and then, and therefore it's okay, and then don't worry about the long-term effects, not realizing that there were long-term effects that will lead to other pathologies. Now, at that time, we didn't know the severity in terms of blip up of cancers, but I knew that there was going to be negative externalities in the pathology. He didn't want to pay attention. He didn't want to pay attention. He thought that, first wave, no big deal. The severity is starting to go down because people were starting to build up antibodies through natural infection or through monoclonals or in the society or, vaccines. If that conversation started, it was probably just the very beginning of the vaccine implementation, right? So he didn't pay attention. He wasn't paying attention to that variants of COVID. For SARS-CoV-2, variants are important to pay attention to, even if the carnage isn't immediate, even if the death rates are somewhat muted, because the latency and the chronicness of the pathology. Didn't want to pay attention, and karma's a bitch, John. Karma is a bitch. When you don't pay attention to people that know what they're fucking talking about, you end up having problems. And now, because now it's hit him, now he is affected. Now there's the cognitive dissonance isn't there anymore. And he's a microcosm of America. He's a microcosm of America not paying attention that both the V and the virus had problems and can cause these situations in people, right? Autoimmune disorder, endocarditis, myocarditis. There's some research that's showing amyloidosis and dementia increases, kidney function problems, liver problems, clotting issues, right? We've heard this, all this stuff. You know, we've heard it ad nauseum, but people weren't paying attention. There's still a huge part of society that thinks that it's all the V and not the, and the virus, you know, they say, well, it wasn't as deadly. That's my point. That's my very point. It doesn't have to be deadly. All it has to be is good enough to cause cancer, to cause heart disease, to cause dementia, right? So it's like everyone was focused on the acute because we're a button push generation. It's immediate. If I hit the button and it doesn't move, then it must not exist. Not realizing that maybe there was a timer, that if you push the button, it's timed. You know, it takes maybe 3 days or a week to change the screen. The button must be broken. Hey, John, maybe the button's broken. Duh. But the reality of the situation is now people that were poo-pooing this, the importance of the changes in mutation as this thing was evolving, right? That, well, now they're, you know, now they're seeing it differently, seeing it like how I said it was going to happen. You know, but, you know. So in the post-COVID era, it's going to be more latent, chronic, slow-moving. There's going to be cognitive dissonance, and, you know, because people don't have the memory, don't want to have the memory of what just happened. They just want to go back to normal, and I understand that. I want to go back to normal, but I can't. I can't. My life will never be the same since this whole fiasco, right? And I would suspect that many of the people that listen or are listening right now, you know, would fall in that category, that there's something that's permanently changed in their life, either their health or they lost someone or whatever. But when I say something, pay attention, because I'm really accurate, and if I'm slightly off, it's because there's some nuance to it that wasn't fully understood. For example, diabetes medication is mildly protective for SARS and MERS. Pay attention. So now, as we're moving on, we're not going to hear a whole lot of number of cases. There's, I think I could be wrong on this, but I think monthly in the United States, it's, I don't know, it's like 10,000 or something. I don't know, it's low, right? You know, and they're mostly mild. They're nothing really major. We're moving in the phase where it's now we're feeling the aftershock of this, the cancers, the autoimmune diseases, the long COVID syndromes, different elements of long COVID, insomnia, problems thinking, you know, vasculitis, lots of different things, right? But there was a big part of the population, virus doesn't exist, or if it does exist, it's not that big of a deal because it's the flu. That's what they thought it was. It's the flu. Not paying attention to. Unfortunately, everything I'm saying I can't keep on YouTube, so, you know, but, you know, might as well just keep on going, right? So, not realizing that there was a humans made this, right? They took something that was somewhat benign in nature and supercharged it in a laboratory and released it, right? The origins of COVID came from Wuhan, because they were the ones that did the human ACE2 jump. And you heard it from me 3 years ago. The other component to this was there was a dual development between Wuhan and Barrick's lab. And oh, by the way, SARS-CoV-1 came out of America. It's a plus 20-year arc of development. But no, this must be just the flu. This must be just the flu. Yeah, right. Yeah, right. Like, for example, you know, when Kaufman came out with his whole terrain theory bull BS, right? Saying viruses don't exist in their exosomes and not really understanding, since he's a psychiatrist, not understanding all the microbiology of exosomes and endosomes and, you know, all the nuances between cellular communication between, you know, between each other and the external matrix around the cells, right? You know, pushing that viruses don't exist. No. Psychiatrist is going to tell you that viruses don't exist. Lovely. Lovely, Kaufman. Lovely. But then you have a lot of people that are out there that are telling you, yeah, it must have been a pandemic. Did a lot of bench work, granted, but some of these people that are saying this never treated a COVID patient. Never. Not one. Not one. Not one. But yet, you know, I had the, you know, sadly, the privilege to be, you know, in a situation where we were treating COVID patients and seeing the real deal as they were going into ARDS. Now, not all patients are ARDS. We've already had this discussion. But the point here is that there's a lot of people who are saying this is just the flu, but never treated actually a person. Actually never been in the actual room working them up. Malone, to my knowledge, never treated a COVID patient. But yet he's going to tell you how it really is. Meanwhile, he ended up taking money as a contractor in biodefense, pre-COVID and during COVID. He's going to tell you how it is. And then he overblows truly the representation of him being the inventor of the messenger RNA platform. Meanwhile, he was a small player and a much bigger player on something else that he downplays, which George has covered extensively. You know, but, you know, I hope things for John will turn out. You know, where everything will be okay, right? But he's got a lot of things going against him. His age is not, you know, he's not a spring chicken. You know? And I think, you know, I've seen this happen so many times over the 3 years. You know, there's these people that just don't pay attention, and all of a sudden something happens to them. Something happens to them. It's sad, because I think that, you know, that he's an interesting character in this whole thing, but he downplayed. In that first year, he downplayed COVID. He downplayed it. You know, a lawyer downplaying something, not paying attention to someone out of the top 10 people in the United States that understands COVID the most. He was not paying attention to me. Do you understand this? Even though I don't have a big following, I am within the top 10 of understanding SARS-CoV-2. And the ones that are above me were part of the weapons program. But John didn't want to pay attention because he thought his law degree was going to help him. He was going to be able to somehow legally, using his legal mind, work it out that, you know, an acute infection doesn't translate into a latent chronic infection. That they're not, you know, there's no negative externalities later down the road, even though you're asymptomatic. Because, you know, the legal mind can figure that all out and say that that's not rational. But yet that's exactly what's happening. You know, cancers are going up. That's a fact. Cancers are going up. They're going not only up in incidences, but going between the stages quicker. That's not a good sign. That's not a good sign. So, lesson learned, pay attention. It ain't one thing. It's not just myocarditis. It's not just autoimmune disorder. It's not just the downregulation of your immune system. It's a multitude of things. And the reason being is that spike protein has been passed through multiple times through serial passage and is like a demon. It's been supercharged to have functionality that you would not have seen in a natural progression of things. They selected features through the cell passage to enhance it and to build a library of lethality. But the crisis is over. Now it's the post era, you know, the post era. You know, there was an aftershock, you know, in parting. You know, there was an aftershock right after Vietnam, right? You know, we didn't know what really, how to engage the Russians, right? And then we started doing proxy wars in Afghanistan, right? Mojahedim and all that stuff. And that was when Brzezinski, you know, pops in on the scene with his chessboard philosophy and everything, right? Right? But the United States had a pivot, had a change. We, as a society, needs to change in the post-COVID era. Because things are going to get interesting, but they're going to be slow. They'll be fast for someone that, you know, let's say, you know, gets the cancer. You know, they're diagnosed and it goes from, you know, stage 2 to stage 3 in a much shorter time period. It's fast for them. At the societal level, you know, going from 1.7 million cases in cancer to 1.9 to 2 million, right? At a societal level, why would you care, right? You can still buy your McDonald's hamburger and fries with no problem. At the personal level, it's a catastrophe. And this is the problem. Same issue that we had at the chronic phase. You know, if it's only 1.1 million people out of 350 million in the United States, it's a small percentage of people that die. So there's not that much of a concern. It's not going to be that much of a concern about the blip up of cancers. You know, maybe it peaks at around 2.5 million annually for new diagnoses. And then obviously the more cancers that are going to pop up, then the death rates will probably increase too, until treatments start to come online. I'd be surprised if the CDC numbers shows an increased peak above 2.5 million annually, but it could. Maybe a peak at 3. It's not going to be 10 or 30 million or anything like that. Well, you know, but before COVID, it was flatlined at about 1.7 million. Now it's at 1.9 to 2 right now. And the only thing that's changed is something that was released and something that was injected. Everything else stayed the same. But there's going to be many people that just don't pay attention, don't remember the echo of history, even their own history, their own contemporary history. Well, thank you for listening. I really do appreciate you listening on these spaces, and the ones that do listen on YouTube, Rumble, Bitchute, and Brighteon. I also appreciate that. You know, I think that it's important to talk about these things to, you know, to understand where this is heading, where this is going. And I think too many people are too focused on, you know, one little aspect of it, right? You know, but the aftershock is coming. You know, like in Oppenheimer, you know, they show the explosion at you know, of the first test, right? And there's this big light, and then there's this time. There's a time delay, right? There's a delay between the actual shock wave. So you see the light first because of the speed of light, and then the speed of sound, right, is slower. So you see the light first. So I'm trying to say this poetically. I'm seeing the light of COVID before the aftershock is coming. And then the people that pay attention to me, they understand that it's coming. The ones that don't pay attention get this aftershock, and they're wondering, why did it happen? You know, and that's kind of a little poetic way to try to dovetail history and art, right, in something that's very real that's coming. You know, to maybe 2.5 million people, 3 million people annually. Probably will peak out at about 2.5. But that's what I suspect in new cancers per year. But we won't know this. We won't see this in the data, in the official numbers, audited official numbers, until 2016 we'll start to see it, but we won't really see a really good trend until the data that comes out after 2026 to about 2030. At 4 years after 2026 is going to be important data, really important data. You know, and maybe, hopefully, maybe there's some sort of positive emergence that takes place, like what we were talking about with the comorbidities of diabetes, but yet the medication happened to be helpful, protective, somewhat protective for SARS-CoV-2 and MERS. Maybe something in the horizon that we're doing is going to be helpful. I don't know. Maybe eat your broccoli more. I don't know. But my gut feeling is that it's going to be peaking at around 2.5 to 3-ish. And then it might just plateau to that, or maybe incidences will start to go down through treatment. We'll see. We'll see. The shock wave's coming. It's coming. For some, it's already hit, like for John. But for the masses, because again, it's only 2 million, 1.9 to 2 million new incidences this year, right, of cancer, then, you know, the far majority, they have it on the back of their mind. It's like, it's not going to happen to me, whatever. Right? But the bigger your friend circle is, or the larger your family, the increased probability at least someone that you know gets it. So thank you for listening. Please subscribe to my channels. I have 3 channels on YouTube. 2 of them are called DrPaulCottrell, and then I have one called Paul Cottrell. All the links are in the description of my videos, so you can just find a video and click the links and be able to easily get to those different channels and subscribe. Please subscribe to my channel on Brighteon, Bitchute, and Rumble. That's DrPaulCottrell. And go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com, and get the supplements that I've been telling everybody to get to be able to weather the storm, because the aftershock is coming. Thank you for listening, and have a nice night.